Where families once believed locked doors were enough to keep danger outside, they suddenly found themselves relying on something completely different: music. In New Orleans, people were told that the safest way to survive was to fill their homes with the sound of jazz. This is the haunting story of the Axeman of New Orleans, one of America's most mysterious and unsolved criminal cases. It was the summer of 1918, and New Orleans was alive with music, laughter, crowded streets, and the unmistakable rhythm of jazz drifting through the city. Yet beneath that vibrant atmosphere, something terrifying was beginning to unfold. The first attack came so quietly that no one understood what had happened until it was too late. In the early hours of the morning, a couple was discovered inside their home after being viciously attacked with an axe. The brutality of the scene shocked even experienced police officers. News of the attack spread rapidly. Neighbors began whispering among themselves, looking nervously over their shoulders and securing their homes more carefully after dark. New Orleans was a city accustomed to celebrations, parades, music, and nightlife. This sudden eruption of violence felt completely out of place. New Orleans was not simply another American city. It was vibrant, colorful, and deeply connected to its traditions. But now, fear was creeping through its neighborhoods, and a terrifying name began appearing in whispered conversations: the Axeman. What made the attacks especially horrifying was the violation of the home. People had always regarded their houses as places of refuge, where families could gather, children could sleep safely, and ordinary life could continue without fear. The Axeman destroyed that sense of security. He did not need to attack banks or stalk isolated streets. He entered bedrooms, kitchens, and family homes. He brought terror directly into the most private spaces of people's lives. The horror was not simply that people were being murdered. It was that familiar homes were being transformed into places of unimaginable violence. Before long, the city began changing. Some families slept with their lights burning through the night. Neighbors checked on one another. Every strange sound became suspicious. A creaking floorboard, a knock at the door, or footsteps outside could send fear through an entire household. Everyone was asking the same question: who would be next? That summer, New Orleans lost something it would never completely recover: its sense of innocence. The Axeman had arrived, and with him came a period of terror that would remain embedded in the city's memory. What began as a series of brutal attacks soon developed into something much larger, a legend that blurred the boundary between a human criminal and a creature from a nightmare. The Axeman was not simply another murderer carrying a weapon. His methods were disturbingly personal. Rather than crashing through doors or breaking windows, he often appeared to enter quietly. In several cases, an opening or panel near the rear of a house appeared to have been removed, allowing him to slip inside while the occupants slept. Even more disturbing was his choice of weapon. He did not necessarily bring one with him. Instead, he could use whatever was already inside the house, including an axe belonging to the family or another available sharp instrument. That detail made the attacks even more frightening. The very objects people depended on in everyday life could suddenly become instruments of violence. Imagine waking in the middle of the night and realizing that the tools sitting in your own home had been turned against you. Something familiar had become terrifying. The attacks were sudden and savage. Victims were often caught while sleeping, leaving them almost no opportunity to defend themselves or call for assistance. When investigators arrived, they encountered horrifying scenes but few useful answers. Blood could be found across walls and floors, yet there was often little evidence explaining exactly how the attacker had entered or escaped. It seemed as though the killers simply disappeared into the darkness after each attack. For New Orleans families, this created an unbearable sense of helplessness. How could anyone protect themselves against an attacker who could turn their own possessions into weapons? How could a family defend itself against someone who seemed capable of entering a home without warning and leaving almost no useful trace? People began looking at their homes differently. Doors, windows, tools, and ordinary household objects no longer represented comfort. They represented possibilities for danger. What truly separated the Axeman from ordinary criminals was not only his violence, but the psychological terror surrounding his crimes. He attacked the very concept of safety. Bedrooms became frightening. Kitchens no longer felt secure. A family home could suddenly feel like a trap. And no matter how hard investigators attempted to understand his behavior, the Axeman seemed impossible to predict. One of the most terrifying aspects of the case was the apparent randomness of the attacks. Detectives usually search for patterns. Criminals often repeat certain behaviors, target particular victims, or follow recognizable motives. The Axeman seemed to offer very little of that. There was no obvious age group that he consistently targeted. There was no clear gender preference. Robbery did not appear to be the primary motive. At times, he attacked members of hardworking grocery families. At other times, women were assaulted inside their homes. This apparent randomness made the fear almost impossible to contain. No one could confidently say, "He won't choose me." Across New Orleans, people began asking questions. Was the killer specifically targeting Italian grocers? Was he acting because of personal grudges? Was he a stranger passing through the city? Or was he someone who lived nearby and blended into ordinary society? The absence of an obvious pattern left investigators pursuing one possibility after another. For ordinary citizens, the uncertainty was even worse. A knock at the door could be harmless. A noise outside could be nothing. Or it could mean the Axeman had selected another house. His unpredictability became a form of psychological warfare. When a criminal follows a recognizable pattern, people can at least attempt to understand the danger and take precautions. The Axeman seemed to offer no such opportunity. He could strike in one neighborhood and then appear somewhere completely different. The city began to feel like a giant chessboard, with the killer moving across it according to rules known only to him. Families began quietly discussing possible suspects. Could it be a jealous rival? A disgruntled grocer? A wandering stranger? Someone from another neighborhood? Or perhaps someone they already knew? The uncertainty became its own kind of torture. Parents kept their children close at night. Couples checked their doors and windows repeatedly. Many people remained awake long after midnight, listening carefully for the smallest unusual sound. The attacks did more than spread fear. They spread suspicion. Communities that had once depended on mutual trust began looking at one another differently. The possibility that the killer could be hiding in plain sight made ordinary neighbors seem suspicious. Perhaps the greatest power the Axeman possessed was not the weapon in his hands, but the fear he created before he ever appeared. Yet not everyone who encountered the Axeman died. Several victims survived his attacks, and their accounts provided some of the most disturbing glimpses into the mysterious figure behind the crimes. Imagine waking from sleep to unimaginable pain, realizing that an intruder is standing over you with a weapon. Some survivors experienced precisely that horror. One young woman reportedly awoke during the night and saw a dark figure standing above her. Before she could properly react, the attacker struck. She survived with severe injuries, including a fractured skull. Although her physical wounds eventually began to heal, the memory of that night remained with her. The figure she remembered was not simply a criminal in her mind. He had become something almost unreal, a dark presence that appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. These survivors provided police with something invaluable, first-hand testimony. They proved that the Axeman was not merely a rumor circulating through frightened neighborhoods. He was real. He had entered their homes. He had attacked them, and he was still somewhere outside. Investigators attempted to build descriptions from these accounts. Some witnesses remembered a tall, thin, shadowy figure. Others offered different impressions. But fear and trauma can distort memory. The descriptions were too vague to identify one particular person. The police were left with an attacker who appeared capable of entering homes, carrying out brutal assaults, and disappearing without leaving enough evidence to identify him. In some ways, the survivors carried an especially painful burden. Their wounds may have healed, but the memories remained. Every unexplained noise inside their homes, every unfamiliar footstep outside, or every sudden movement in the darkness could bring them back to the night when death had stood beside their beds. For New Orleans, their survival was both reassuring and terrifying. It proved that the Axeman was not a ghost story. He was a human being, and he was still free. Then the case took an extraordinary turn. the Axeman appeared to communicate with the public. A letter, reportedly written by the killer, reached the Times-Picayune in March 1919. It was not merely a threat. It was a theatrical declaration of power. The writer portrayed himself as something more than an ordinary criminal, claiming to be a demon from hell who delighted in the fear and chaos surrounding his crimes. The tone was mocking and almost playful in its cruelty. He ridiculed the authorities and suggested that no police force could ever capture him. But the most terrifying part was the warning that followed. The writer announced that on a particular night, he would roam through New Orleans, and homes without jazz playing would supposedly become targets. For a city already living under intense fear, the message was extraordinary. The Axeman was no longer simply killing people. He was attempting to dictate how an entire city should behave. He was telling families what music to play and how to spend their night. The threat turned murder into psychological theater, and New Orleans responded. When the threatened night arrived, the city transformed. Families turned on their record players and filled their homes with jazz. Dance halls became crowded. Bands performed late into the night. Even people who were not particularly fond of jazz reportedly made sure that music could be heard from their homes. For many, this was not entertainment. It was survival. And according to the legend surrounding the event, no one was murdered that night. The city had survived. But there was something deeply unsettling about that survival. New Orleans had not defeated the Axeman. It had obeyed him. For one night, an entire city had changed its behavior because of the threat of a mysterious killer. When darkness settled over New Orleans, the atmosphere became almost surreal. During the day, everything appeared normal. Streetcars moved through the city. Grocers served customers. Children played outside. Businesses continued operating. But as evening arrived, anxiety spread through the neighborhoods. Families secured their doors, lit lamps, and prepared their homes. Some arranged for musicians to play. Others turned up their record players. Jazz poured through windows and doorways. From busy areas to quieter neighborhoods, horns, drums, pianos, and voices filled the night. Dance halls were packed, and music spilled into the streets. Families who did not own record players found other ways to produce sound. They borrowed instruments, played records belonging to friends, or simply made music themselves. The entire city seemed determined to make sure no house was silent. It was as though New Orleans was attempting to drown its fear beneath a wall of music. Behind the laughter and dancing, however, the terror remained. People were not celebrating because they felt safe. They were playing because they were afraid. The music became both a shield and a desperate plea for survival. Neighbors who rarely interacted began gathering together. Records were shared. People danced in crowded rooms and tried to convince themselves that the night was ordinary. But their attention constantly returned to the doors and windows. At any moment, they expected a shadow to appear outside. The music was a mask. Behind it, the city was trembling. When morning finally arrived, the atmosphere changed. The night had passed. No major attack had occurred. Musicians were exhausted from playing for hours. Streets and gathering places showed the remnants of a long night. The people had survived, but the psychological cost was enormous. The Axeman had demonstrated something powerful without necessarily committing another murder. He had made an entire city change its behavior. For one night, New Orleans had danced because it was afraid not to. For the police, the case was becoming a nightmare. Whenever another attack occurred, officers arrived at scenes marked by violence but lacking the evidence they desperately needed. There were broken locks, blood, damaged property, and frightened witnesses. But there was no clear trail. The killer did not appear to carry a recognizable weapon from one crime to another. Valuable possessions were often left behind. A straightforward motive remained elusive. It seemed as though the attacker could enter a home, commit his crime, and disappear before anyone could understand what had happened. Detectives questioned neighbors, relatives, acquaintances, and business rivals. They followed one lead after another, yet almost every promising theory eventually collapsed. Survivor descriptions were equally frustrating. One person might remember a tall, shadowy figure. Another might describe someone smaller and quicker. The differences made identification nearly impossible. Fear had distorted memories, and investigators were left trying to construct a reliable picture from incomplete accounts. As frustration grew, some people began wondering whether the Axeman might actually be something close to the supernatural figure he described in his letter. The pressure on law enforcement became intense. Citizens wanted arrests. They wanted answers. But the police had neither. Every failure increased public anxiety. People began suspecting neighbors and strangers. Some were accused without evidence. The atmosphere became so tense that fear itself began producing new conflicts. The Axeman had done more than attack individuals. He had damaged the trust holding communities together. Behind closed doors, investigators debated competing theories. Was the killer mentally unstable and motivated by a desire for attention? Was there a method behind his seemingly random choices? Could he be a local resident who lived an ordinary life during the day and became a predator after dark? Or was he a drifter who could move through the city and disappear just as easily? No theory could be proven. The absence of evidence kept every possibility alive. The police repeatedly seemed close to understanding the case, only for another development to push them back into uncertainty. For the people of New Orleans, this lack of progress was terrifying. If the authorities could not protect them, who could? And if an intruder could enter a home while a family slept, what prevented him from choosing another house the following night? The Axeman did not merely leave crime scenes behind. He left psychological scars. Over time, his story became part of New Orleans culture. The city was already famous for its music, folklore, mystery, and legends. The Axeman's story fit naturally into that world. His crimes eventually became more than a police case. They became a story told through music and popular culture. Jazz musicians responded to the strange combination of fear and fascination surrounding the killer. Songs appeared that referenced the Axeman, including The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz and Don't Scare Me Papa. The music reflected something uniquely New Orleans. Instead of allowing terror to completely consume the city, people turned it into art. They laughed at the darkness because sometimes humor was easier to bear than fear. The Axeman's story also traveled beyond New Orleans. Newspapers across America reported on the mysterious killer and his extraordinary letter. The image was almost unbelievable, a murderer who supposedly demanded jazz from his potential victims. The combination of violence, mystery, music, and theatrical threats captured the public imagination. As the years passed, the boundary between historical fact and folklore became increasingly blurred. Was the Axeman simply a human criminal? Was his letter genuine? Was he responsible for every attack attributed to him? Or had frightened people gradually combined separate crimes into a single terrifying legend? His story eventually became woven into the mythology of New Orleans alongside tales of haunted buildings, mysterious figures, supernatural traditions, and restless spirits. Tour guides began retelling the story to visitors walking through the city's historic streets. Listeners imagined a dark figure moving through the night while jazz poured from frightened homes. Although the original fear eventually faded, the fascination remained. In a strange way, the Axeman became another symbol of New Orleans, a city where music and tragedy, celebration and death, mystery and history have always existed side by side. His crimes were horrifying, but the story that grew around them became something larger. It became a reminder that even during periods of terror, a city can transform fear into music, memory, and legend. By the autumn of 1919, New Orleans had spent more than a year living beneath the shadow of the Axeman. People had become accustomed to sleeping with lights on. Some kept music nearby. Many continued to fear what might happen after dark. Then, almost as mysteriously as he had appeared, the Axeman disappeared. The final attack associated with the case occurred in October. Once again, a family was attacked inside its home. The scene carried familiar signs of violence. A victim survived the assault, but the testimony provided investigators with few new answers. Once again, there was a shadowy figure. Once again, the attacker seemed to vanish. There was no dramatic arrest, no final confrontation, no undeniable clue that revealed the killer's identity. After that, the attacks attributed to the Axeman stopped. At first, residents feared that he was merely waiting. Perhaps he was watching. Perhaps he was allowing the city to become comfortable before returning. Families remained cautious. Police continued watching for crimes that might be connected to the mysterious attacker. But weeks became months. Months became years. The silence continued, and that silence was almost as disturbing as the violence itself. Rumors began filling the space left by the missing killer. Some believed he had died in a violent confrontation. Others thought he had left New Orleans and continued his crimes somewhere else under another identity. There were even people who embraced the supernatural explanation. Perhaps, they suggested, the Axeman really was the demon he had claimed to be and had simply returned to whatever darkness he came from. No explanation was ever proven, and that was the greatest source of frustration. The people of New Orleans never received the closure that comes with an arrest, a trial, or a confirmed identity. The Axeman simply disappeared. He left behind injuries, frightened families, unanswered questions, and a story that refused to die. More than a century later, his shadow still hangs over New Orleans. His story has survived the detectives who investigated him, the witnesses who remembered him, and the newspapers that first spread his threats. His identity remains uncertain. His motives remain unclear, and questions still surround the authenticity of his famous letter. Historians and criminologists have proposed numerous theories. Some believe the Axeman was a serial killer driven by psychological instability. Others have suggested that some of the attacks could have been connected to criminal disputes or organized crime, particularly because several victims were Italian grocers. But no theory explains every detail convincingly. The apparent randomness of the attacks, combined with their theatrical elements, makes the case difficult to interpret with certainty. Then there is the letter. Was it genuinely written by the killer? Could it have been written by a copycat? Was someone exploiting the city's fear for amusement or attention? No definitive answer has emerged. What is certain is that the letter transformed the case. It elevated the Axeman from an unknown criminal into a larger-than-life figure. He became a legend. A century later, ghost tours and storytellers in New Orleans continue to mention his name. Visitors walk through historic streets while listening to stories about the mysterious killer who supposedly demanded jazz as protection against death. Musicians still reference him. Writers still draw inspiration from the case. And the same question continues to appear. Could the Axeman have committed crimes somewhere else under a different identity? Because he was never caught, his story has no conventional ending. There is no courtroom confession, no confirmed identity, no final explanation. And without an ending, the story continues to breathe. Every generation can retell it. Every storyteller can add another layer of mystery. In that sense, the Axeman achieved a strange form of immortality, not through fame or accomplishment, but through fear and uncertainty. For New Orleans, his story remains a reminder of the things people cannot explain and the dangers that sometimes hide behind ordinary faces. The Axeman entered New Orleans like a shadow and disappeared just as mysteriously. Was he a disturbed man consumed by violence? A criminal hiding in plain sight? A drifter who vanished into another city? Or was there something darker behind the legend, as the mysterious letter claimed? Perhaps the truth will never be known. But one thing is certain. The story of the Axeman continues to echo through New Orleans, carried by the same music that once filled frightened homes during that legendary night. Jazz became a symbol of defiance, fear, and survival. And somewhere between history and folklore, the Axeman remains one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. So the question remains, was the Axeman simply a human killer who was never identified, or was the legend hiding something far more sinister?